Hey y'all, I'm picking up where we left off in chapter 11. It'll be right here. But before I do begin, I just wanted to remind you guys that if you log into Epic and click on your assignments, this book has been assigned to you. So if you want to follow along to the sound of my voice, then log into Epic, click on the book, turn to page 121, and then play my video so you'll listen to my voice at the same time that you're reading, and it's like you're following along as I read. So that's one way to do it. If not, you can just follow along on the screen or listen in the background. All right, here we begin right here. As soon as Sacagawea put the baby on the ground, Seaman moved to his side. The big dog positioned himself between the fire and the child. If Pomp started to crawl beyond the ring, people seated around the campfire, Seaman nudged him back into the circle. Captain Clark loved to watch little Pomp. Your son is a born explorer, Janie, he said to Sacagawea, but he'll never explore any farther than the campfire if Seaman has his way. Look at how that dog keeps an eye on him. Who would think a dog that hunts as well as a wolf would become a tender-hearted nursemaid at the sight of a baby? Lewis smiled. Why, William, I believe we could say the same thing about you. You got such a soft spot for this baby. I wouldn't be surprised if you found yourself a wife and became a family man just as soon as we stepped foot back in the United States. On October 15th, the explorers could see the mountains in the distance. The next day, the Corps of Discovery reached another river. According to Twisted Hair, this was a mighty river that flowed into the Pacific Ocean. The captains knew this must be the Columbia River, from the reports of the United States sea captains who sailed to the west coast of North America. Look here, Meriwether, called Clark. The river is so clear you can see pebbles, even grains of sand on its bottom. The group made camp for 2 days to explore the area around the farmed river. Now that they had reached the Columbia River, they knew that they would be able to find the Western Sea. Feast your eyes on all that salmon, exclaimed Lewis, looking into the river. Have you ever seen so many fish? Most of the salmon had just spawned and were dead or dying, but Seaman splashed into the river and swam downstream. When he returned, he was holding a large wiggling salmon. He shook the water off his coat and then trotted over to York, carrying the treasure proudly in his mouth. No. Did it again, y'all. And I figured out how to do it, so give me a second. Sorry about this again. All right, let's try that again. It's because I don't have my the mouse, the clicker. I'm having to just use my laptop screen. Okay. You get me a couple more of those big juicy ones, Seaman, York said, kneeling to take the fish. Seaman wagged his tail, his tongue hanging out and his bright eyes focused on York's face. He looked like he was grinning. We're going to have some fresh fish with our supper tonight. Fried crispy on the outside and juicy on the inside. Now that will be some fine eating. York pointed at the river. Go ahead, Seaman, get me some more of these fish. Seaman woofed happily and bounded back to the river. One evening, some local Indians came to trade with the explorers. A brave was wearing a sailor's jacket. Lewis touched the sleeve of the jacket and raised his shoulders to ask where the man had bought it. The Indian drew a picture in the dirt with a stick. Lewis stood beside the brave, cupping his chin in his hands, and he watched the drawing take shape. Seaman stood next to Lewis, following the movements of the stick in the Indian's fingers. The drawings looked like a rough outline of a ship with the masts. The captain's eyes met. Were they close enough to the Pacific Ocean for local Indians to trade with sailing ships? When the Indian finished his drawing, Twisted Hair questioned him. Yes, Twisted Hair nodded to the captains. The jacket had come from white men who sailed big waters, the Pacific Ocean. The captains beamed. They were nearing the Western Sea. On October 23rd, the explorers encountered a wild section of rapids and waterfalls on the Columbia River. I'm not surprised, Meriwether, Clark said. If we're getting close to the Pacific Ocean, the Columbia River has to drop quickly to sea level. Lewis nodded. Let's have a look at the river and decide whether we can send boats through. The captain took seamen for a walk beside the noisy river. They had shot so their voices could be heard from around the sound of the rushing water. They discovered a waterfall nearly 40 feet high and made plans to portage around it. The captains decided that they could run most of the rapids, but in some of the rougher spots these men would need to empty the canoes and lower them by ropes through the rapids while standing on the banks. As soon as the canoes were in safe waters, the men would refill them with the baggage and passengers and proceed on. Indians gathered on the river banks and watched the explorers run their canoes through each section of rapids. These Indians were from a tribe called the Chinooks, and they did not look or dress or speak like Twisted Hair's people. They were shorter, with large flat feet that pointed heads. On their upper bodies they wore fur pieces, short robes, and beads around their necks, arms, and legs. Most of them wore nothing except a small skin tied around their waist and between their legs. According to Twisted Hair, the Chinooks were not friendly with the Nez Perce. As the corps continued down the Columbia River, the Chinooks visited the explorers' camps, eager to trade. These Indians made wonderful canoes that were lighter than the explorers' dugouts, yet sturdier and easier to navigate. Lewis managed to purchase one of the Chinook canoes by offering the smallest of the expedition's dugout canoes, as well as several other items, including a hatchet. The next section of rapids was a quarter-mile of swirling water that swelled between rocky ledges. The captains packed their most valuable items on the non-swimmers' backs and told them to scramble alongside the river. The other explorers, along with the heaviest baggage, would take their chances in the canoes. Hundreds of Chinooks gathered on the banks to watch. "Why are all these Indians standing along the banks?" York asked. "They make me nervous." He looked at the river ahead, "And I don't need any help feeling nervous when I see that water leaping and roaring below me." No. Nope. Come on. Coulter looked at the crowd of Indian spectators. "You know why they're watching us, York. They think we're crazy to run these rapids," Coulter grinned. "They think our canoes will end up in splinters and our baggage will wash downstream. After we break our full necks, the Chinooks will shake their heads at our stupidity and gather up what's left of our belongings for their own use." York scowled. "These Indians live here and ride along the canoes all the time. If they think it's crazy to run these rapids, why are we going to try it?" "Maybe because we are crazy," Coulter said mirthfully, as he pushed one of the canoes in front of the frothy water. He nodded at the others in the canoe and dug his paddle. As the roar of the white water swallowed their voices, York thought he heard Coulter whoop like a boy diving happily into a cool pool on a hot summer day. York shook his head, smiling. "Maybe we are crazy, I don't know," he muttered. "That John Coulter is crazy for sure. As crazy as they come, that man. He eats danger for supper." Lewis stood on the ledge above the river when the canoe swept through the rapids. He held a rope coiled in his hand, and he kept seamen by his side. If a boat overturned, the passengers would desperately need seamen's help to pull them out safely. To everybody's amazement, none of the canoes splintered on the rocks. Lewis, seamen, and the Chinook Indians watched all the canoes run the rapids without a loss of life or baggage. For the next few miles, the river was fairly calm. Then began a 3-mile stretch of wild water. Again, the Chinooks gathered along the banks to watch the disaster. Again, the explorers made it. After these rapids, the corps camped for 3 days to dry out and repair the dents and leaks in the canoes. The captains named the place Fort Rock Camp. At this camp, Twisted Hair said goodbye. He was no longer able to help them trade with the Indians since they had left the lands of the Nez Perce Nation. The explorers would be able to find their way to the Western Sea by staying on the Columbia River. It was time for Twisted Hair to return to his own village. On October 29th, the Corps of Discovery proceeded on, reaching the next section of the rapids on the last day of the month. This was the most frightening section of the river for the explorers had seen. It was 4 miles long and full of waterfalls. When Captain Clark wrote about it in his journal, he described great numbers of both large and small rocks, water passing with great velocity, forming and boiling in a most horrible manner, with a fall of about 20 feet. It took 2 full days to get the canoes through these rapids. The explorers portaged around the worst of the falls and lowered and empty canoes with ropes through the worst of the rapids. Whenever the men thought that they could run the rapids, they hopped aboard and rode the foamy, gushing water, paddling around boulders and avoiding dead trees that could snag the boats. "We did it, William," Lewis exclaimed when the canoes were in calm water again. "We made it through 4 miles of rapids without any injuries. We didn't lose a single canoe." The next day the corps awakened to a fog. The canoes reached Beacon Rock, which marks the beginning of the Columbus River's tide water. From that point on, tides sweeping into the mouth of the river caused the river waters to rise and fall. On November 4th, the corps made camp near the mouth of the Willamette River. Sea captains had come this far inland on the Columbia River, and they had described the area in their writings. So the expedition was now in territory that had been explored and mapped by English speakers. Clark beamed. "For the first time since Fort Mandan, we have a real map to guide us," he announced. "Not just a drawing in the dirt, but a real map with English words." As the explorers continued moving west, the Columbia River began to widen. It was becoming an estuary, which is a passage where the tide meets the river current. It was becoming an estuary, a section of river where the seawater mixes with the river's fresh water. Here's the image of them, y'all. That must be Coulter on the front with his big smile. The climate of the estuary was different from that of the upper Columbia. The sky was cloudy most days and it rained often. A thick cover of plants lined the banks below tall needle-bearing trees. Ducks and gulls swam noisily by the canoes. Swans glided gracefully through the waters. The Chinook Indians lived in the villages along the river banks, and they were eager to trade, and they often visited the explorers' camps with roots, fish, and meat. "It's gone," Coulter muttered one evening after a group of Chinook traders had visited camp. "What's gone?" "My tin cup. I left it right here on top of my pack. Those Indians were standing here showing Captain Lewis a basket of roots that they wanted to trade. I walked over to the fire to see if the water was hot, and when I came back, my cup was gone." Coulter frowned. "And the Chinook traders are gone too. Have you noticed how our things seem to disappear after those Indians pay a visit to our camp?" Shannon and Coulter looked into the darkness around them. "They're long gone, John. You'll never catch up with them in the dark." Coulter sucked his breath in and clutched his fists. "Every time we turn around, those Indians steal something." "I'm sure it's frustrating," Shannon agreed. "They come into our camp, charge us outrageous prices for their food, and walk off with anything they can find. But it's not worth stopping to fight with them. Just forget it, John." The corps of Discovery kept moving west toward the ocean. Paddling as rapidly as they could, the explorers covered 30 miles each day. On November 7th, when the fog cleared, the explorers saw such vast expanse of water before them that they thought that they had arrived at the Pacific Ocean. The waves rocked their canoes and crashed against the distant rocks. Seagulls squawked overhead. "Hooray!" the men shouted. "We've reached the Western Sea!" They lifted their paddles into the air, cheered, making the canoes teeter in the waves. Seaman jumped to his feet, barking at the commotion. The men grinned and hugged each other. Coulter leaped into the water, and Seaman jumped after him. The two splashed into the cold water until the captains called them back into the boats. That evening, Captain Clark wrote in his field notes, "Ocean view, oh the joy." And we are done, and we'll see you on chapter 12.